So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and we will be doing another of the free-for-all battles, the siege type free-for-all battles that Womb Raider sent me towards the tail end of October last year. So they've been sat on the shelf for quite a while, but I do now have enough progress made through my backlog to the point where I don't really have too much else, which sounds a little bit derogatory, but of course I do tend to give a little bit of a lower priority to free-for-alls like this. As much as I actually prefer seeing how they work out, people tend to prefer watching standard sieges rather than the free-for-alls, but we will be seeing this one, and this is actually the one he wanted me to show more than the others, so this could very well end up being rather interesting. I believe it's because of the alliance shifting that we will be seeing going on throughout this battle. But yes, the Ardenheim Outpost, which is another cityscape style map, but the Cardland Outpost was a little bit more enclosed than this. The Ardenheim Outpost is larger, a little bit more difficult to hide within, a little bit more difficult perhaps to dig in, though not impossible of course. Back here is where we typically see a final stand when this is being played in its more traditional standard siege format, and so if you do manage to dig in up here, you will find yourself in probably the best single defensive position that the map has to offer. All the teams will have singular factions as well on this occasion. There won't be any mixing and matching like we saw last time. Each team of two is going to be its own faction, though of course a free-for-all by its very nature, it's very, very difficult for it to be lore-friendly, and so of course on this occasion it is not. But yeah, plenty to happen on this map, plenty of wide open spaces, tree cover, little settlements outside of the main one here, which is going to be the focal point of the map, of course, it's always going to be. And then there's also the canyons over here, which is where we're going to be starting, because this is the player who sent me the battle replay, the Womb Raider himself, playing on the team that is the Misty Mountains, just like the last time in the free-for-all map on the Cardland Outpost, the Misty Mountains, who were victorious on that occasion. We shall see if they can repeat their feat here. I can see why you would want to play the Misty Mountains in a free-for-all situation like this, purely because you have the numbers as the Misty Mountains to really take quite a lot of punishment, and you can also hold a fair amount in reserve. You can also send forward not your entire army and still have a fairly intimidating force, so pretty good, although they do have their obvious drawbacks. Stuff like morale and overall quality could still suffer, and in the late game that could be enough to tip the balance of power away from you. But the Heavy Goblin Spears are pretty much a no-brainer, as we've often said, and in the very last battle actually as well, on Moria we mentioned that the Heavy Goblin Spears are by far and away the Misty Mountains' most efficient frontline combatant if you don't want to spend an awful lot, because they're more resilient by far really than the Heavy Goblin Infantry. Then they have the anti-cavalry bonus. The armor piercing means against most foes as well they're actually going to do more damage in melee, so yeah, definitely a worthwhile inclusion to have them be the central point of your line. Heavy Goblin Halberdiers, which are a cheap anchor point to the Misty Mountains force. It's not the most effective one they have, but it's the only one that they can pump a huge amount of numbers into without going into the red limit, and while they may not be anything too special, they can represent a nice bit of efficiency in your line, especially against armoured troops, and in a free-for-all situation like this, late game phalanx units in much the same way as a siege battle can show could very well be very, very important. Heavy Goblin Crossbows, as always, the Heavy Goblin Crossbows could be one of the focal points of the Misty Mountains' efforts to go on to win this fight. I think they need to be quite careful. I think they do need to save them for later, because if they commit them too early, it's exactly the sort of target which all of the other teams will be wanting to get rid of, because it's one of those units which you know is going to be effective if they can get into position. And in the late game, if you've got nothing to answer them with, they can pretty much win the game for the Misty Mountains. Crossbows have got that kind of stopping power, though they are fairly vulnerable, of course, to both arrow fire, and in melee they are terrible. So there's that. Mountain Orc Berserkers, more armor piercing, though certainly much more aggressive armor piercing than we've seen in the two Heavy Goblin units so far. And they're also locked morale, which does mean that they make up for one of the very notable weaknesses that the Misty Mountains have as a faction throughout, so a nice bit of armor piercing punch. And then the Snaga Skirmishers as well. As we've already mentioned, numbers are going to be an important quality all of their own here, and Snaga Skirmishers, with the amount of saturation they can apply to a front line with all of their relatively low tier but still armor piercing javelins, it's the sort of thing which, much like in a siege, you can't afford to ignore them, but unlike in a siege, you can get to them a little bit more easily, potentially, if the Misty Mountains are not focused on you, and they're exactly the sort of thing which is going to rout or just outright die under any sort of pressure, really, in melee. Snow trolls are very quick, and when there's a lot of ground to cover on a map like this, snow trolls can be very useful. The trolls for the Misty Mountains were used very early in the last free-for-all siege we saw on the Cardland Outpost. They were used to crush Rudour underfoot, or help crush Rudour underfoot. Though with all of that armour piercing they had, it was a sort of fight where the trolls were always going to be expended completely by the time the battle reached its end. Further up here we've got the Bolgs Champions, a bit of a no-brainer once again really. When you've got open spaces, when it is a free-for-all, high-tier cavalry, always going to be useful, as we saw in the last battle, though maybe not as much as I was expecting, but nice to see them once again. The Warg Riders, a little bit surprising not to see the Warg Skirmishers, I do prefer them with their javelins, are a little bit more multifaceted, but the Warg Riders, at least with that second hit point, avoid the pitfalls that single HP cavalry fall into. We mentioned briefly the upper end phalanx unit that the Misty Mountains have at their disposal, which is of course the White Uruk Fearmongers. Nice armour piercing that they have there, again the sort of thing which late on could be really decisive. We have some Black Uruks of the mountains to offer a little bit more quality in the centre of their infantry force as well. They are fairly numbers heavy here, the Misty Mountains, as you would expect, so a little bit of quality to help them out is all well and good. We already mentioned the heavy goblin infantry. They are very cheap, but that's really where the nice things I have to say about them begin and end. The deficiencies they have in comparison to the heavy goblin spears are clear for all to see, but yes, a couple of units of them, and then some bodyguard units as well. The Blackback Berserkers are a little bit further back, and the Goblin King's bodyguard are here. Again, you want your general to be in the Goblin King's bodyguard really, because they can't hide anyway, and they are also the more defensively minded unit of the two. The Blackbacks, you want them to be able to hide just in case, and also you want to be able to use them a little bit more aggressively perhaps, and it's more likely that they may have to strike out on their own. Bodexa is once again his ally, so the Misty Mountains alliance once again in full swing. We'll go through this army a little bit more quickly, because I imagine it's going to be the same kind of units for the most part. Goblin King's bodyguard, heavy goblin crossbows, Bolgs Champions. He's got some heavy goblin archers once again, so maybe this is the play. Going in for a little bit more long range here, Bodexa, though on a map like this, with their starting position, they're really just going to be here just in case they need to get involved in a prolonged skirmish, so they have something to answer the enemy with. They're not going to be the most damaging, and they're not going to be the most useful unit otherwise. Goblin infantry, snow trolls, we've got some more heavy goblin infantry there, we've got some goblin spears, more mountain orc berserkers with that locked morale of theirs, a couple of units of cave trolls as well, smashing through an organised defence quickly, maybe the sort of thing needed to wrest control of the settlement away in the late game if the Misty Mountains are already looking a little bit depleted, depending on where they choose to engage on the field, or where someone else chooses to engage them. But yes, plenty of halberds and spears, a little bit of standard goblin infantry mixed in there as well. Now then, moving on, we have Dol Amroth, played by Josh. He's got a huge and dizzying amount of siege weaponry. I don't know necessarily if this is going to prove to be a good idea, but he's got 2 ballistas and 2 catapults. I mean, this is the sort of thing which is definitely going to raise eyebrows among the other players. It's definitely unorthodox. I think it effectively stops players from camping in very advantageous spots, I guess, because with this amount of artillery they could literally wipe an army out if they just decide to sit there and take the punishment that they're willing to dish out. But there's no way, based on this, that those other teams are going to do that. So you've forced the enemy's hand in a way, but you've also forced it in such a way that you can't respond to in turn, I think. We'll see. Plenty of civilians. We've got some Parathil Horse Guard, of course, in the new patch of the game. They are 2-handed sword units instead of sword and shields. Knights of the Silver Swan, a couple of units of them too, and some Parathil Riders, some Horse Archers with the Arathirim, deadly Arathirim, of course, in and amongst them. So yeah, considering there is a settlement on the field, very unorthodox Dol Amroth armies this, because they're cavalry and siege heavy, which is interesting. It's the sort of thing you perhaps see in Age of Empires 2 more so than in a Reforged, but here we are. Because his ally, Y2K, has done much the same thing, though he has foregone 2 ballistae, he's only got 1, he's got 2 catapults once again. Knights of the Silver Swan, more Arathirim at the far end as well, with that very high stat block that they have. Parathil Riders and Horse Guard once more, stretched out a little bit more, but unorthodox. Interested to see how it works. I doubt Dol Amroth to put themselves in a particularly advantageous position with that kind of composition, but we shall see. And also single HP cavalry, as I've already mentioned, not great in this version of the game. Then we have Diego Rio Ramos, who is playing as Dale. Some upgraded Bardian marksmen await, and if they can dig in the settlement, Dale are one of the factions that will really make a good job of making it their own, but of course with the catapults and ballista or ballistas I should say, from Dol Amroth. That is maybe less of an attractive proposition. Barding Herd, the armour piercing, will be very useful against the Misty Mountains, as we've already seen, and also anti-cavalry. Clearly going to be useful against Dol Amroth, given the rather unorthodox composition they have gone for. Dalian Royal Black Shots, and the Dalian Paladins as well, so the trifecta of high-end Dalian units. The general actually in the Black Shot Dragon Slayers, which is interesting. The Paladins can be used more freely. The Dalian Royal Guard also perhaps the tankier melee combatant, comparatively speaking, and more upgraded Bardian Marksman. The stakes, of course, going to be something which Dol Amroth will have to take into serious consideration. It's very possible that more of Dale's army is also hidden in and amongst those trees there, given the fact that we can't see too much else, and his allies' army in Leech is over here. Some upgraded Dalian Spearmen and Lake Town Pikemen guarding this approach, so I think Dale's play is going to be to try and occupy the settlement, which is understandable. Their faction is set up for this sort of warfare if they can occupy it, but it may also paint a target on their backs or fronts. More Lake Town infantry, so they've got a few shots before they turn into light infantry dedicated. Barding Herd and Earls of Dale, the classic Dalian front line. It's fairly expensive, but it's tried and tested, and there aren't too many forces that are going to feel massively confident about going into them, with the armour piercing they have and the defensive prowess that the Earls of Dale also have. Some more Dalian Spearmen, some Lake Town Pikemen just in behind, more Black Shots, more Dalian Paladins, more Earls and Barding Herd guarding this approach, so I don't know if they're going to stay there with all of that artillery to be had, and Bardian Marksmen as well, more Earls and Barding Herd. So maybe not so much in Leech's army, but I would imagine we'll probably see Athala Rangers and River Patrol pop up somewhere, especially from Diego's force. And finally, the last army on the field is going to be the Gondorians, played by Tommy the Wise the First. He has got the Gondorian Spearman with the full upgrades, Gondor Infantry with the full upgrades, of course, Gondor with their cheaper upgrades, very, very useful to make use of them. Plenty of armour piercing from the Citadel Guard and Fountain Guard. I'm interested to see this, actually. I think Gondor have got the more multifaceted infantry force, and they are just as capable at long range as Dale. Both factions are well set up for a slog within a settlement like this. Who is going to have the edge? I don't know. The armour piercing from these units from Gondor will be useful, but Dale maybe have got the better base attack on stuff like the Earls. We've got some veterans of Osgiliath, Gondor archers, fully upgraded, both of those units as well. Civilians, a gap which probably denotes the Athelian Rangers, let's be honest. A couple of units of fully upgraded Axemen of the Sarnak. That kind of armour piercing will be very useful against the Dalians and against the Misty Mountains should they come forwards. Pelagia Marines with some javelins. We've got the Mithrandir's retinue as well, so cavalry is the sort of thing which they're probably going to have to leave until later, given Dol Amroth and actually Misty Mountains as well, with the Bolg's Champions and the Warg Riders. They're going to have to bide their time, Gondor. They've got the Warns of Minas Ithil with the armour-piercing shot and the Trebuchet as well, so some artillery. It hasn't been completely monopolised by Dol Amroth. And then we have a giant cluster of a Gondorian army, commanded by D.F. Mark. He has got some marksmen of Caer Andros in there. We've got some Gondor archers. There is the general in the wards of Minas Ithil. There are some guards of Osgiliath, guards of Osgiliath, not veterans of Osgiliath, but yes, guards of Osgiliath, which is a rarer choice than you may expect. I think most people kind of depend on the Fountain Guard to do that job, but they don't have the same range as the guards of Osgiliath, so that is worth bearing in mind as the battle goes on. Some standard Gondorian cavalry, wards of Minas Ithil are in there. That's a second unit of them, I think. A ballista, so more defensive artillery, because Gondor very much have taken their position at the summit, which is almost certainly going to draw the ire of all the other players. But artillery, they don't have the advantage there though, most certainly not. Gondor cavalry, some standard militia as well to help pad out the numbers. So a decently numerous army here from D.F. Mark, kind of difficult to see absolutely everything he has. Ravenhelms are a nice aggressive unit of infantry as well. But yes, I will make a little cut. I don't know when the battle is exactly going to get underway. It's a fairly long one, this, but I do think there will be a period of transit at the start of this one. Dale and Gondor are very close, so they may start trading blows fairly quickly. We'll have to wait and see. So this may be a short cut indeed, but we'll see. I'll join the battle when it's about to get underway. So I guess we're rejoining here then, with the Gondorians going on the offensive against Dale, and this is going to be a relatively long one, and I do know that there's going to be some twists and turns that occur during this, but the conflict for this settlement at the very least is going to begin between the two human kingdoms, and then over here we also have the small matter of Dol Amroth's extremely unconventional army here. And I suppose they have everything they need. If the battle takes place on the open field, their cavalry will be very, very useful. If the need arises for them to dislodge someone from the settlement, in theory, their extremely high amount of artillery means that they should have everything they need to do that as well. But the fact that there's really nothing in between means that they're not going to be especially able to adapt to certain situations. And with the numbers of the Misty Mountains, with the amount of anti-cavalry they have and the amount of damage that they can afford to take at the hands of stuff like the Parathil Riders, I do worry for them slightly, in the sense that they have decided to go after the Misty Mountains first and foremost. But taking up a position in this narrow valley is maybe not ideal if all of that artillery decides to make its way across, which I'm sure it is. And we of course have effectively the escort cavalry as well. It's easy to lose track of just how much cavalry Dol Amroth have here. Definitely dangerous. Much of the single HP cavalry, as I've said before, is far too fragile for my liking in terms of how the meta of the game shakes up, but still. Part of me kind of wants Dol Amroth to go on to win from this position just because of how bizarre their army composition is. Honestly, if I were the other players on the battlefield as well, the ones that I would be looking at to be my target first and foremost would be the Gondorians. They do, after all, occupy that part of the settlement which is the final stand in a more traditional siege battle, and it's a very defensive one as well, so not too surprising to see the fact that Dale are not too eager to simply march into Gondor's jaws for the time being, as the battle does march forwards. The Gondorians become more and more of a target, the more of an advantage they hold positionally and numbers-wise. The town infantry were threatening to fire there. And this is going to be a little bit of a theme throughout this battle, I would assume, where a lot of it is going to come down to manoeuvring. In free-for-alls you very rarely see full-blooded engagements early. You're much more likely to see people try and dance around one another, but in the case of doing so against Dol Amroth, really all you need to do is put up a strong front of anti-cavalry, and there's not a huge amount they can do. They have been blunted fairly effectively. The artillery is going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting, and the Misty Mountains are now cut off from interacting with the main settlement on the battlefield at all as a result of this Dol Amroth cavalry moving forwards. But unsurprisingly perhaps, the Misty Mountains are banking up into a far more defensive shape in behind this bit of terrain as well. There is the small matter of a fair few of their units being essentially cut off in this canyon, but there's not really enough here to justify Dol Amroth going all in with their artillery either, so the Misty Mountains, I think, have manoeuvred in the way that you would expect, given the kind of opposition that they're facing here. Yet more cavalry on its way across to pretty much ensure that the Misty Mountains are locked down in the part of the battlefield that they are already in. More of their units now moving backwards. Such is the way of things. Some civilians have fallen from the odd volley from the Lake Town infantry. I think this is going to have to be one of those battles where I do make use of double speed. You can see we do have trading back and forth between heavy archers, is it? Bardian marksmen, and actually it's the Warns of Minas Ithil, so maybe not so much, but trading back and forth between the standard archers of both Gondor and Dale. There isn't going to be much to choose between the two of them. You would argue that Gondor have got slightly the advantage in melee, but Dale can field more of these heavier archers if the composition is correct, but much of a muchness really. Many of these kingdoms of men have got access to these heavier archers, which they will be able to trade back and forth with without too many issues. Parathil Riders still represent the front line. Heavy Goblin Spears and Archers. I mean, Heavy Goblin Archers with the numbers they're in means that the Horse Archers can simply move forward and take their pick of targets. But I mean, Dol Amroth have forced the Misty Mountains' hand here. There's not really anything else that the Misty Mountains can do in order to react to the current situation. The only thing they could do is move all of the cavalry they've got over here away so that the Misty Mountains could maybe make a play for the settlement in the middle. So far, though, the battle lines have definitely been drawn in more of a 2v2 fashion. Mithrandir's retinue do have a good opportunity to continue charging into the Lake Town infantry, and they are completely free. The Ballista also trying to do the same thing. They've been trying to draw the Gondor cavalry into the Dalian spearmen to more efficiently deal with them. Battle that will inevitably take place at the foot of the big statue of Sauron. This is the sort of situation that may crop up in a post-Sauron world. The remnants of his minions, and then all of the jealous kingdoms of men playing off against one another for domination. Surely Gondor first in line for that. And with the position they've taken up, every chance. The only issue that Gondor do have, perhaps, is if they do start getting ganged up on, there is no escape for them. There is no way down other than through the enemy. They could retreat further back, I suppose, try and play the enemies off against one another should the need arise, but still, heavy goblin spears, I mean, this is exceedingly risky. Surely, well, maybe an understanding has been reached. Because otherwise, surely these heavy goblin spears would be turning around, and a decent chance of silencing a few artillery pieces with just this one unit. Artillery crews, after all, very weak and feeble when it comes to their melee abilities. But yes, have the Misty Mountains and Dol Amroth decided to come to an accord? It's the sort of thing which those still trading blows within the settlement should be looking at. But also things have all fallen quiet over here. This is one of the reasons why this kind of battle is a little bit more difficult to cover. Very fun to play in, but more difficult for me to speak about, because there are large periods where really nothing happens other than manoeuvring. This may even be a moment for the rarest of ×6 periods to be utilised in the actual recordings. It's a lot of Dol Amroth cavalry though, and betrayal is always something which may be on the cards, but there is a certain amount of trust being placed in one another here. All of that artillery so close to the goblins as they move. The artillery actually is going to catch up with the goblins, and that means that they're going to start killing one another whether they like it or not, so the heavy goblin spears do end up picking up the pace as a result of that. Gondor militia infantry still in behind. Mithrandir's retinue galloping forwards, some of the Gondorians moving further forwards, giving a little bit of a love tap perhaps to the Earls of Dale. Gondorians with their javelins as well. Leech may be trying to manoeuvre, but I mean, these Gondorians have overextended themselves away from their lines a little bit. Dale do have the opportunity to move forward and potentially deal with them. Just a little bit of anti-cavalry to keep the Mithrandir's retinue in check, and stuff like the Earls and the Barding Herd would easily be able to deal with standard Gondor spearmen and Pelagia Marines in melee. And if the javelins continue to hound Dale like this, then Dale should make the attempt to make the Gondorians pay for this. More javelins on the way in. Barding Herd bloodied. The Earls do move forward. This is also attracting the attention of some of the Dalian archers. It is the cavalry which Dale are clearly worried about. Ah. Well, well, well. Betrayal indeed. And Dol Amroth, based on their composition, there's not a huge amount they can do to save all of this artillery, and as unfortunate as this kind of is, because so much of this artillery is going to end up falling by the wayside now, and we're not truly going to see the artillery barrage that maybe we would have wanted to. But the Misty Mountains clearly seeing all this artillery as an unacceptable threat going into the later game. There we go, ruthless betrayal. You don't owe any other team anything in a free-for-all after all. Victory is the only thing that truly matters. And all of those artillery crews are going to break. So a huge facet of Dol Amroth's plan going forwards is now lying in shambles. They now only have the cavalry, so if the battle does in the late game pivot to take place within the Ardenheim outpost entirely, it's the sort of thing which Dol Amroth are not going to be particularly well equipped to deal with. All these trolls as well, without any charges coming in, the cavalry is also going to start to slip away. It must be pretty soul destroying if you're the Dol Amroth players in this situation. You think you've come to an understanding. Dol Amroth did come over here clearly with malicious intent though, parking the artillery there as they did. If they wanted to go after the settlement, they would have taken the direct route. They had the road leading directly to the front entrance of the outpost. They would have taken it if they wanted to. They clearly saw the opportunity to put the Misty Mountains under some sort of pressure. Then an understanding was clearly reached, but the Misty Mountains always had betrayal on their minds. This is the sort of thing which is going to clearly be attracting the attention of the players within the settlement as well. There's not a huge amount going on over here still. There's a little bit of damage being done, but Dale will be winning in these little skirmishes that Tommy has decided to engage in. But yeah, with Earls significantly the strongest melee infantry unit that's being used over here. Elsewhere, got some reinforcements as well, taking cover and behind. In Gondor, if they intend to be in places other than the back end of this settlement, then they need to make that decision fairly quickly, I think. Otherwise, as soon as, well, it's going to be the Misty Mountains at this point with Dol Amroth being in the state they are now in, as soon as more units arrive into the outpost itself, Gondor will be trapped, as I've already mentioned. Mithrandir's retinue do charge in, the Dalian spearmen taking a decent amount of damage there, and the Gondor spearmen actually starting to come out on top as a result of the artillery support that they've been getting. Dol Amroth, there are trolls in and amongst here as well, trying to put the Dol Amroth cavalry under pressure, though they are fairly isolated out here in the middle of nowhere. So this is probably not going to go their way. Parathil Horse Guard, I mean, melee cavalry is all well and good, but Bolg's champions and wargs will be able to give as good as they get, if not more. Dead goblins and dead knights litter the field, the artillery crew lie dead and betrayed on the field now. And the Misty Mountains continuing to push forwards. There's still a fair amount on the mini-map though. You can see Dol Amroth still with civilians aplenty, as well as all of this cavalry, which, I mean, for Dol Amroth at the very least they now have ample reason to take a back seat in the battle until the time is right now. When it comes to negotiating with other players and justifying the reason for their inaction, they can say that, well, we just got hardcore betrayed and one of the main aspects of our army has been completely eliminated, so we're not going to be moving for the time being until we see an opportunity to do so, though going for a whole cavalry focused composition is an active choice that was made before the battle even began. So that is worth bearing in mind as well. Lake Town infantry getting into position. I have to say, I think that while nothing too decisive has happened within the outpost so far, short of those artillery strikes that have been coming in, I think Dale have done a reasonable job considering they have more disadvantageous ground to stand upon. Gondor have decided to move forward with advanced parties that have been roundly dealt with so far. Missiles sailing overhead going after the Gondor militia infantry. Veterans of Osgiliath moving forward. Now this is the sort of unit which will win a skirmish fight against the most basic of Dalian units. Even the Bardian marksman wouldn't really be a match. You would need to dip into your bodyguard tier units as Dale if you wanted to win 1-1 against a unit such as that. Barding Herd still waiting, some routing Gondor Spearmen, routing the wrong way, as often units tend to do in Medieval 2 for some unknown and alien reason. Like town infantry going to be getting into place, so Gondor don't have anywhere they can really go anymore. Like I said, to get out of this settlement, they now have to go through, at the very least, Dale. In all likelihood, the goblins will arrive at some point to contest the interior of the settlement as well. Interesting little engagement this between the Gondor militia infantry and the Dalian spearmen. Numbers advantage in favour of the Gondorian swordsmen. Dalian spearmen are a higher tier unit, but will that spear malice prove to be important? Veterans of Osgiliath moving over to here now. Trading back and forth. And so far, I mean, this will suit the Misty Mountains, because both Dale and Gondor are taking these minor losses going into the later stages. Both of them will need to be dealt with if the goblins are to have their second victory in a row in such battles. What have we here? All the Dol Amroth cavalry. Moving north, I think they may be looking to consolidate their cavalry force at this stage. Parathil Horse Guard on the move. Misty Mountains regrouping themselves. That Dol Amroth cavalry is looking rather menacingly on. A Rohirrim style charge is definitely on the cards if they are able to execute on it for Dol Amroth. At this stage, even if they don't go on to win, I'm sure that they will want to ensure that the Misty Mountains also have their battle end in failure. Andros. Waiting for the opportunity to shoot into the goblins as they approach. And still, Dale needs to be careful not to overextend with not enough units. This is something which Gondor have already fallen afoul of with those Gondor spearmen that were lost earlier on. They have forced the lower tier Gondorian units back a little bit further, and with that as well the veterans of Osgiliath. Heard the mechanical clank of the crossbows then. Terrain, something which can be used for a small amount of cover, though the Misty Mountains army is big enough to the point where some element of it is always going to be at least partially visible. Parathil riders trying to do what damage they can, but also having to deal with projectiles. Interesting that the crossbow is being used on what is really such a footnote of a unit at this point. If you have any of your regular heavy goblin archers left, then you should probably be using those. They're certainly not going to be up to scratch when it comes to trying to dislodge Gondor and Dale from the settlement, but they can be useful for warding off the amounts of damage which Dol Amroth want to inflict upon you. Gondor and Dale still definitely attacking one another, but not in the kind of quantities that's going to truly decide this fight. Forward come the Mithrandir's retinue again. The lances do come down, but not in time, and the spearmen are willing to move forward. There's the clear projectile, so they do charge in there. Dalian spearmen got that unit of Gondor cavalry, standard Gondor cavalry, as I've already mentioned. Not the finest quality units that you're likely to encounter on the field. Further back, Mithrandir's retinue are a little bit more like it, but having already seen action and the damage that that entails, I do think the Misty Mountains' overall idea is to get towards the settlement, and as well it should be. If they can get off the open field, then Dol Amroth's designs on revenge become significantly less likely. It does mean that they will be put in direct conflict with Dale and Gondor, but that's worthwhile. Heavy Goblin Spears moving forward. They may be spears, but still, at the hands of a full-blooded charge from the Arathirim, that's still going to do a very hefty amount of damage here, especially when they're this isolated, this far away from their support. And the Haven Knights are coming in, maybe a little bit less devastating off the charge, but more of the Dol Amroth riders are falling. But like I said, if the idea is simply to weaken the goblins in an act of revenge, then any damage you can do to the Misty Mountains at this point will be seen as a little bit of a victory for Dol Amroth. A little bit of damage coming in from the Heavy Goblin Archers. This also makes Dol Amroth a potentially useful force for Gondor and Dale if either one of them can persuade Dol Amroth to work with them. Maybe old loyalties from a Gondorian perspective, or maybe new opportunities from a Dalian perspective. Bardian Marksman with the spears in close proximity. Dale are doing the right thing here though, because advancing into the Gondorians when they occupy this defensive position with artillery and rangers and high quality defensive infantry, especially those spears that Gondor like to traffic in, to advance forward would be to essentially lose. They would maybe cause Gondor to lose with the losses they would incur as well. They would put firmly in the driving seat the goblins. Charging in there. Parathil Horse Guard managing to find a gap, getting into the Heavy Goblin Archers. More damage being done. More cavalry on the way forwards as well. That Rohirrim-esque charge begins, and the Goblins not fully in position to deal with that. The Horse Guard being sword cavalry means they'll be less devastating, but you can still see a fair amount of dead goblins left in the wake of that charge. Orcs champions and trolls, and if you can trap some of this cavalry unit, or some of these cavalry units, within your infantry formations, then it's going to be fairly painful fairly quickly for Dol Amroth. But actually I have to say, their charges have been pretty well executed since the Misty Mountains started trying to move across to get to the relative shelter of the settlement. At the very least, all of their infantry and trolls and polearms and the like may very well find themselves to be more at home in that urban style of conflict, instead of out here in the open getting smashed to splinters by Cav. And still, I mean, these units over here are a little bit scattered, a good opportunity. And who knows, Dol Amroth, while the cavalry isn't ideal for fighting within the settlement, if the enemy is weak enough, maybe they can have victory. Again, charging into the Heavy Goblin Spears. Even these relatively healthy units as well are becoming shaken under these consistent charges. Plenty of opportunities still as well. So the Misty Mountains are being made to feel the pain a little bit as a result of their earlier transgressions. We here, Gondor moving forwards, Dale creeping forwards with their own Dalian spearmen. Standard Gondor infantry, especially with the armour upgrade, should be enough to defeat the Dalian spearmen all on their lonesome, but a counter-attack here from Gondor, perhaps seeing a bit of an opportunity to take advantage of Dale, thinking that Gondor would just stay defensive all battle long. Let's see how they get on. A little bit better for Dale over on this side of the statue with only one unit of infantry so far. They do need the support of those Axemen and Lasarnak. Over on the other side though, with Citadel Guard galore, more Axemen and just more Gondorian units in general, Dale starting to feel the pain themselves. Artillery the trebuchet also being used as a supporting measure for this counter-attack. Raven Helm's also on the way forward, so a decent force to counter-attack with this. Gondor trying to force the issue a little bit. Perhaps fancying their chances against Dale and seeing that the Misty Mountains maybe are going to continue to take a decent amount of damage at the hands of Dol Amroth. Maybe they feel as though now is the time to try and make something happen. Much of the Misty Mountains, however, will make it to the settlement, and they will begin to pose a problem as well. This is bad news for Dale, of course, more than anything else, because the goblins, in order to get involved in the settlement, do need to go through Dale first before they ever encounter anything from Gondor. And so, for Dale, situation looking a little bit precarious at the minute. How do they intend on dealing with this? Artillery support, the melee fights, not looking fantastic for them either. Armor-piercing projectiles falling down from on high, but none of them with the perfect angle. Defeat seems certain, too much of the Dalian line being made up of by highly average mid-tiers or slightly underpowered hybrid units. And with all the support of those Gondorian missiles as well, you can see that the momentum certainly with the Southerners here. And there goes the Dalian General, at the hands of the Bolg's champions as well, so the Misty Mountains once again assassinating an important aspect of the Dalian army, and those Blackshot Dragon Slayers as well with their projectiles would have been something Dale would have been very eager to preserve on the field. They are coming in again. And that may very well be the end of the Blackshot Dragon Slayers in their entirety. These Misty Mountains units managing to get within the settlement. Heavy Goblin crossbows though, so it hasn't been a perfect crossing across the map for the Misty Mountains. Dol Amroth have been able to take pretty decent chunks off of the Misty Mountains force, though their ability to do that will be coming to an end with polearms acting in a supporting role. And as much as they may have done Gondor a bit of a service by killing off one of those Dalian generals, Gondor, seeing the scale of the Misty Mountains infantry that there still are of course going to start opening up with their archers and going after important targets. I mean, the White Uruk Fearmongers would be a good one. Heavy Goblin crossbows, another Black Uruk, so plenty of good targets for regular archers to try and deal with. Dale's starting to stabilise themselves on the front line as well. The arrival of the Barding Herd has definitely done wonders to assist Dale on their front line endeavours. Trebuchet starting to wind itself back in. Further back, defeat a distinct possibility for Dale over here. I mean, Gondor were stronger on this side of things, so it makes sense they've managed to maintain their forward momentum in this fight, even with the Barding Herd's arrival. What do Dale intend to do? Do Dale intend to cut and run? Try and salvage some of their units? Civilians of Dol Amroth or this cavalry? Moving outside of the settlement at this point poses a fairly unacceptable risk, I would suggest, for pretty much all of the other three teams, with Dol Amroth's cavalry always having the potential to shark in and get some more juicy kills. Try to utilise artillery and flaming shot to break the Dalian. Some of the more basic units are. The Barding Herd were even shaken for a moment there. Morale bombing them with some success. Defeat is still a distinct possibility over here for Dale as well, so credit to Gondor for actually going on the offensive and making something happen. And with around his retinue, not quite in the same condition that they once were, but still a good opportunity to shoot into the Bardian Marksman here. I do find it interesting that the Bardian Marksman capes have got the lamellar effect as well. A metal cape would be extremely uncomfortable to wear, I think, and of extremely limited utility. As Randy's retinue being joined by the Gondor cavalry, the charging and hammer and anvil strikes continue. Civilians are utilising their shovels. Dol Amroth will be attempting to use their own farmers for such as well. Dale still with a presence on the field, though it must be said that Dale have definitely come out of this engagement the worse, and the Misty Mountains biding their time and waiting. Dol Amroth scattering out a little bit more, heading out into the open field. There will come a moment, of course, where if Dol Amroth are one of the last two factions left alive, you would suggest that they kind of have to make a move, because going cavalry, full cavalry, should have downsides if you allow it to get to that point. It's a big risk to bring an army like that rather than a more conventional one like we've seen with all of the other teams, as much as I do like a bit of variety. You do have to question it when it comes down to the nitty-gritty. All of that artillery would of course have been potentially devastating within the settlement, and I am sorry that it died early on, but also we got to see a fairly brutal betrayal as a result of that. Then you play the game. The Misty Mountains will no longer have to worry about all of that artillery in the late game. Dalian Paladins, victory. In pure melee terms against this cavalry, yes. But the charges, as always, vital. What do they do from here, Dale? Dale, I think, are the ones so far who may actually be in the worst shape of all. Late game, if it does come down to infantry slogs, they do have pikes, they have dragon slayers and the like, but in terms of sheer numbers, Dol Amroth with all that cav could potentially be more devastating. What do Dale want to do? I think they need to find a friend here. Will they be able to, though? Will they make an alliance with the goblins? Already proven themselves to be unreliable as far as a loyal ally goes. Do they try and make a temporary peace with the Gondorians, in spite of the losses they incurred around Sauron's statue? Or do they secure their flanks and rear by attempting to forge an alliance with the cavalry forces of Dol Amroth, circling like sharks outside of the outpost? There is battling going on out here, and by the looks of things, partially the decision has been made for them. For Dol Amroth are starting to hunt the Dalian units that are still outside of the outpost and going after some earls, some lumbermen. Clearly, it's a well-known strategy in a free-for-all to leave some hidden units in reserve until the very end to come swooping in to deliver your victory to you. Dale will be denied that. I mean, for that to be lumberman, it would be a risk for that to be your primary strategy anyway, but it's going to be denied them. Although the lumbermen actually are killing off these Parathil Horse Guard. In sustained melee, heavy axemen also useful for dealing with cav. Further back, Gondor, in spite of that earlier counter-attack, still very eager to dig in at the summit of the settlement. Kings of the hill for the time being. Over on this side, still the civilians the least intimidating part of the Gondorian army, or Dol Amrothian army. Aliens being routing into the distance. Can't help but feel like some of the Dol Amroth cavalry has concealed itself within the trees. It is an interesting situation to be in now. As long as the other three armies stay within the settlement, to a certain extent they are sheltered from the Dol Amroth cavalry. But that also means that they're closer to one another, and eventually one of them's going to have to make something happen. I do still think that marginally perhaps the goblins have got the most numbers, though when you factor quality into that you could argue that Gondor are actually in pole position, especially with the location that they have dug into on the battlefield. What have we here? Marksman of Caer Andros. Plenty of ranged units still available to them. Still a fair amount of cavalry in behind the civilians over there. We're starting to see, we are starting to see Dol Amroth enter the outpost. This may be a little bit premature. Don't know whether they're going to be able to make anything of great note happen. There are stakes as well to consider, so the Dol Amroth players will have to be very careful not to run over those. Not the sort of thing they would be able to recover from, really. And still, eager to punish earlier transgressions, charging into and taking small chunks out of heavy goblin infantry units is not the most important thing, but anything to damage the Misty Mountains' hopes of going on to win this, that is enough to break that small cavalry wing. So in the end, Dol Amroth did end up losing proportionally more, but if, like I've already said, after the artillery was killed, if their sole goal is now to just do damage to the goblin army, then any charge they get really is one step closer towards the fulfillment of their goal. In behind, cavalry and civilians starting to make their way forward. A single unit of halberds probably does lose to that big mass of civilians, so that's something else to consider. And the goblins do find themselves in the middle now. They have Dale and Gondor on the outside of them in the settlement, and then there's Dol Amroth ever menacing them with the cavalry from behind as well. You can do a lot of good work in a free-for-all though by painting a target on your own back. You can coax the enemy into you, and then, although if there's nowhere to retreat to and if you don't have anything in reserve, then it can be a bit more of a problem, you would suggest. Rotting meat being flung at the Sauron statue. Gondor... Ooh, hello. Gondor, I guess, in control of the settlements early on, considering where they deployed, so it's surprising they haven't torn that statue down yet. Herethil Horse Guard charging into the heavy goblin infantry, and as a result, they are effectively forcing the goblins back into a more defensive posture, heading into the middle square of the outpost initially, but now retreating back into their shells a little bit. Horse Guard charging in. There's still a fair amount of goblins over here. A little bit of joint ops between the Gondorians and the Dol Amrothians, but Mithrandir's retinue end up routing. There is still a fair number of heavy goblin spears after all, and the retinue already exerting themselves against Dale earlier on in the battle. Herethil Horse Guard still there. Goblin halberds slowly moving in. More Horse Guard, Dale. The ones in this situation that are probably the most happy. They're the only ones who are not receiving damage of any kind. The Arathiran moving in. Trying to make something happen here, Dol Amroth, which is all well and good, but I feel as though this may have been a little bit early in the battle still to shoot your shot. Lots of civilians coming in. Cavalry trying to find gaps, but the civilians, with support, all those heavy goblin halberds that were initially holding the rear line, but with stuff like Goblin King's Bodyguard and White Oak Fearmongers and plenty more Goblin infantry on the way forward. All of these civilians are going to be stopped in their tracks, and this may well be the beginning of the end for Dol Amroth. Not the most surprising thing, though, in the battle, given how brutally they were betrayed earlier on. It should not be too great a surprise that maybe they're not in the best of positions going into the latter stages here. Gondor, meanwhile, will be very happy with this, as will Dale. The Misty Mountains taking yet more damage, having to exert yet more effort, though not too much more. That felt like more of a kamikaze charge than anything else by Dol Amroth. And there goes a Dol Amroth general, caught in the middle of the White Uruk Fearmongers as he was. Good opportunity, though, to shoot into this blob, and actually the Gondorian archers may well end up doing more damage as a result of this than the Dol Amroth cavalry did. Again, with that pretty much suicidal charge that we just witnessed. Now taking cover. Still Athelian Rangers, still a lot of strength for Gondor, honestly. And Gondor at this point must be considered in the driving seat of the battle. They still occupy the best defensive ground on the map. And now Dale and the Misty Mountains have both weakened. Surely at some stage those two forces are now going to have to look at the Gondorians and think we need to do something about this. Gondor, I think, are being quite shrewd as well, because every now and then they are sallying forth with a little expeditionary force just to, I think, lull the other players into a false sense of, well, Gondor, they're moving forward, they're losing manpower fairly consistently, which they are, but it's all measured, I think, this from Gondor. If they maintain enough strength in that final stand position, eventually it'll get to the point where there simply isn't enough of an opposition on the map to dislodge them from that. And if that does come to pass, then the other teams have got no one but themselves to blame. When you're at the highest point on the map, which is very clearly the best defensive ground, and no one ever does anything about it in any real terms, then they deserve to lose and you deserve to win. Nobody is. Misty Mountains still have a few nasty units. I mean, crossbows still a presence. Absolute Berserkers, plenty of armour piercing. Gondorians moving forward and trying to shoot into the Misty Mountains position with a little bit, maybe trying to coax them forward, but if not, at the very least it will be doing a consistent amount of damage to the targets they perceive. Still the Gondor archers as well. Further back, Citadel Guard on the march forwards. What do they intend on doing? Some routing goblins. They want to try and attack into Dale. I don't know whether Gondor should bite off that much. Simple skirmishing with the goblins may be enough to achieve their aims here. The armour-piercing projectiles of the Wardens of Minas Ithil as well. Forward come the Trolls. Such a high reliance on archers over here. A counter-attack of this many cave trolls, bloodied as they are, they haven't really taken too much in the way of damage since the early stages of the game. A good opportunity to deal with battered and bruised units, this. The Gondorians, this is going to be enough to convince them to scurry backwards, which maybe lends credence to the fact that this was all a little bit of a feint. But they have committed enough forwards to the point where their losses will be felt. Marksman Carandros having to deal with the savagery of the Blackback Mountain Berserkers. Ballista shots still coming in as well, so the fact that the Gondorians still have artillery in that very nice defensive position of theirs is something else in their favour, another feather in their cap. Still some Dol Amroth cavalry around the place as well, so not completely done yet. More opportunities for them perhaps, although if I were Dol Amroth, of course, I wouldn't be looking to further the goals of the Misty Mountains at all, so as much as that cavalry would be incredibly useful for trying to take some more bites out of the Gondorians, I think I'd be more tempted by spitting in the eye of the goblins. But that is just me. Goblin infantry. More of a token force here, just to let Dale know that, you know, we do see you there. We're not going to completely leave our flank exposed. Perhaps in the way that you did with that general earlier on. Gondorian cavalry still alive as well. Another unit of Mithrandir's retinue. More goblins skewered and trampled under hooves. Has proven to be a concern in this battle so far. The Mithrandir's retinue charges into trolls can be effective, but as soon as it comes bogged down into a melee fight, that's where trolls turn the table on cavalry. Turn the tables, I should say. They turn back around. The trolls already slightly damaged, although on this occasion they're just going to bump into the trolls, although I think they did actually get the charge off them. The lances did come out, and they did go down. But more damage being done. Those cave trolls could be very, very useful for battering through lines quickly and trying to get after artillery and archers, which Gondor still have in fantastic positions. This one unit of Gondor spearmen which has been left behind. Flaming shots being used as well. It's a real problem here. I mean, I think for the Misty Mountains, the course of action is clear. They need to try and get Dale on side. They need to try and work together. The Misty Mountains may have just about enough in terms of manpower to force their way through the Gondorians and win the battle outright. But positionally, with the artillery being there, it's a risk, and even if they were to do that, Dale would then simply swoop in and finish them off when they weren't looking. For the Misty Mountains, the only course of action is to try and get Dale on side to help them with Gondor, and then late on they should be in better condition to kill the Bardings off, go on to win the battle overall. For Gondor, they just need things to keep ticking over as they are, the Misty Mountains to continue to take losses as they are currently, and for Dale to attack before the time is right. And for Dale, they need to basically insist on the Misty Mountains going first. Ballista hitting those whiter at Fearmongers, another good choice of target here. But once again, being forced backwards, Misty Mountains. Every time they move forwards just a little bit, they're then rapidly forced onto the defensive. Earls out there. Still Dol Amroth Cavalry, the Arathirim, and Haven Knights from Y2K. Sort of thing which, if it does become close enough in the late game, it's the sort of thing that Dol Amroth could snatch a victory away with. Though easier said than done. Gondorians, as if in a gesture of goodwill, they are stepping down off the high ground now. I feel as though from this point onwards, as soon as the ground is set and someone makes the move to force the issue, we will very quickly start to see this battle head towards its conclusion. Gobbo infantry. Not the sort of thing you want to be relying upon to secure your victory late on, but I think the fact that the Misty Mountains still have those units hidden back here, those Mountain Orc Berserkers, which perhaps the other players are still yet unaware of, as well as some Blackback Mountain Berserkers, that could be key. them thrown in at the late game. Armor piercing useful against both Gondor and Dale, regardless of which one it is that they have to face off against. Gondor on the way over. A Mexican standoff here. No one trusting one another, and rightly so. Misty Mountains with their treachery well observed, and Gondor and Dale have already knocked 7 bells out of one another in this fight so far. The Goblin crossbows, and they are shooting directly into Dale. The Misty Mountains maybe trying to curry some favour with Gondor by saying that maybe they should just crush Dale between the two of them, and then settle it like gentlemen at the end, and I believe that is exactly what's going on. It's unfortunate for Dale, but you could also make the argument that they've sat here doing nothing for a rather long time in this battle at this point. If they were willing to take a step forward and maybe, bury the hatchet with Gondor, I think that would have been a wiser course of action, honestly, than going into business with the goblins. But it is it's been a battle of twists and turns. Definitely understandings have been reached. Of course, we know exactly what the Misty Mountains still have left available to them, and stuff like the Snaga skirmishers being hidden and that clutch of units back there is the sort of thing which, unless Gondor have really been paying attention, will have slipped the net. And time again we've seen free-for-alls such as this resolve themselves with a clutch of hidden units at the end sweeping in and being too much for the others to deal with. We've already seen Dale try to do that with some lumbermen and some cavalry, which Dol Amroth rooted out. Dalian Royal Guard. Still a small matter of the Dol Amroth cavalry, which they're going back outside of the settlement, which to me suggests that they're not interested in going after Gondor, because otherwise they would be. They would have had the ideal opportunity to smash into 2 units of Wardens of Minas Ithil and all of this infantry on the front line, which is critical really in their attempts to defeat the Bardings once and for all. Gondor actually struggling a little bit to make things stick. The Misty Mountains may be doing so on the other side. So Dale, I don't know, I don't think there's really any escape for Dale at this point. Barding herd are there, but they're fleeing because they're routing, not because they're being purposefully retreated. It's not the sort of force which you can just send anything against and Dale will fold, but as long as you're willing to commit a decent enough number, this could very well be the end of Dale's chances. Dale, well, I mean, once again, I don't really know what Gondor were expecting. They too have felt the sting of betrayal from the Misty Mountains, but they've had form for doing this in this battle so far, and they took the bargain. They took the bargain, and you can't say more foolish than that. Part of the reason why, especially, I mean, it's all well and good for us. We also know that the Misty Mountains have got a decent clutch of units still remaining to them, but Gondor very clearly had their plan. They wanted to dig in, take the good defensive ground, allow the others to sort themselves out, and then ultimately have too much left in the late game. They deviated from their strategy at the behest of their opponents. There's no other way of saying that, and I think from here on we can start to see the battle take shape, and we can start to see it move ever more so towards the goblins. You can see the Dol Amroth, the original betrayed, trying to do more damage to the goblins. I mean, the goblins could very well still crumble in the face of their adversaries. Obviously the Misty Mountains things can turn around pretty quickly for them with their morale being what it is, but as much as there are plenty of soft and vulnerable targets for units like the Haven Knights to go after, I don't know, the damage that they have received further afield. Will Dale survive? Probably. At this point, Gondor cannot sustain this assault. The Misty Mountains were never interested in fully going after Dale. Gondor were always the true prize. Gondor doing their best. I mean, with Fountain Guard over here, they may have enough to kill Dale off, though even if they do that, the only ones that's really servicing in the long run are the Misty Mountains. The final 10,000 frames is now here. Do Dale have an ace up their sleeve? Do Gondor? Do Dol Amroth of all people? No, all of these units are routing. Dol Amroth, the Arathirim on their way across to go after who, I wonder. Bolg's champions are still there, acting as a little bit of a buffer for any sort of Dol Amrothian shenanigans that may be forthcoming. Dragon Slayers firing into the Bolg's champions, doing a good job as well. The Arathirim just clattering into the back of the Dalians there, ironically enough, so not all about revenge against the goblins, still willing to go after other people, perhaps seeing there might be an opportunity for them, though of course still those hidden units. Artillery, the Trebuchet, I think the Trebuchet was out of ammunition anyway. I've seen the Trebuchet use plenty already in this battle. Goblin King's bodyguard at the centre of this effort, some blackbacks as well. I don't know how long the heavy goblin infantry are going to last against this level of Gondorian opposition, especially with the ballista also offering its support. Minister Thiel and Athelian Rangers still in support with the ballista. I think that's everything from Gondor. I mean, having a look further back, not a whole lot else. Guards of Osgiliath trying to slow the goblin progress. It's not a foregone conclusion just yet, but everything that the goblins have done in this battle so far has furthered their agenda. The Arathirim charging through. It does look as though Dale are going to survive over here. There are still some Gondorians left, but the formation is buckled and the level of Dalian infantry that is still over here substantial. The Arathirim have the opportunity to be a real menace. Of course, for the goblins, if they do continue to make progress against Gondor, that works for them, but if not, the units they still have in the corner can be unleashed later. The Gondorian general falls at the hands of the Dalians in the other microcosm of an engagement that's going on at this stage. Heavy gobbo crossbows. Crossbows this late on as well. Now actually losing this fight, the Misty Mountains, unsurprisingly, given the level of Gondorian units that were left behind for this kind of final stand situation, but the more crossbow bolts find their mark, the less likely that this is going to be to carry the day for the southern kingdom of men. Out of ammunition, heavy goblin crossbows just being flung in as well. Any more Gondorians that they can kill here in these later stages of proceedings going to be important. Gondor perhaps feeling a little bit more confident now. They're winning that engagement in melee after all. Perhaps the Misty Mountains shot their shot too early from their perspective, though of course we know that that isn't necessarily the case, though we don't know for sure if Dale have anything still lurking, or if Gondor themselves have anything hidden up their sleeve as well. When it comes to a free-for-all, we can only really take at face value the team that we are viewing the battle from the perspective of, and on this occasion I think, considering we are viewing from the perspective of the most treacherous team on the field, I think that we have the best viewpoint. Andy's retinue. A few units still in support for the goblins. There's still the small matter of the Arathirim. I mean, 20 Arathirim at this stage in the battle. It's not completely beyond the realms of possibility that Dol Amroth go on to win this. There's still Dale alive as well, not with tons and tons, so amusingly enough, we're not that much closer to knowing who actually goes on to win this. I would still suggest the Misty Mountains just because it is another unit of blackbacks that they have up their sleeve and 3 units of Mountain Orc Berserkers. That's a lot of armour piercing, it's a lot of attack, and it's also a fresh infantry bodyguard unit. But if they were to be ganged up on, charges from the Arathirim could be vital. Wardens. Still 27 blackbacks over there as well. These Athenian Rangers allegedly still have a bit of ammunition to them. A lot of routing units there. Forward come Dale, so Dale perhaps seeing this as their opportunity. Blackback Mountain Berserkers not being charged into by the Arathirim, but then the Arathirim don't want to charge at close range only to be butchered by the most dangerous melee combatant of the Misty Mountains. And are Gondor actually going to win this outright? I'm not sure they are. I suppose it would be fairly in keeping with the team that tried to take the best defensive ground on the field to be the ones to ironically fall first in a free-for-all, though I would say that on this occasion Gondor have got no one but themselves to blame for that, for reasons we have already seen in full. Dragon Slayers. So yeah, the announcer now feels as though the Misty Mountains have the advantage, and it is because of this, and in fact I think it might even be 4 units of Mountain Orc Berserkers, so it's 5 units of merely damaging to very damaging that they still have up their sleeves, and they're still not yet ready to commit them, perhaps waiting for Dale to commit themselves first. The Arathirim acting in accordance with the Gondorians at this stage by the looks of things, so they have once again bent the knee to their overlords. Imrahil still alive, at least one of them. Are they going to go after Dale? I think they probably will. Damage being done courtesy of the Blackshot Dragon Slayers. It's exactly the sort of unit that they are designed to go after. These very high profile ones. I think as soon as the battlefield becomes a little bit more clear cut and everyone is more clearly defined, I think that's when the goblins will pounce. Although at this point they've got nothing but orcs really. Mountain orcs. Blackback Mountain Berserkers trying to do a little bit more damage before they decide to throw caution to the wind, I would assume. 4 of them still live, the Athelian Rangers still there. It's going to be the end of them, surely. The Ballista using its valuable ammunition on the Dalians, still trying to make something happen. Still 2 Goblin King's bodyguard as well. Well, a banner carrier and the general himself, Medexas. The Ballista out of ammunition by the looks of things as well, so that might be what the Misty Mountains were looking for. What is this? Heavy Goblin crossbows on the way forwards. And that is one of the 2 generals. The other one will die off pretty quickly as well. That looks like the last of the ammunition volleys they have as well, pulling out their swords. The Misty Mountains will lose their 2nd general though, the other one dying at the foot of those trebuchets. Guard still running, still biding their time. I mean, there's still close to 4,000 frames left after all. But it's going to be... I would have liked to have seen the reaction of all of the other teams to each of the things that the Misty Mountains have been effectively allowed to get away with in this battle, because the final nail in the coffin will be the reveal of all of those units they've got in the corner. So from that perspective, the battle... There's no real jeopardy to the battle anymore, because we know really what's going to be going down. Athelian Rangers facing off against what remains of the Dalian Royal Guard. It's going to be Dale as well that they will probably end up facing off against. The Arathirim charging in. A few of those Dalian Royal Guardsmen. Not much remains, really. And the Gondorians are moving in. There's not much else they can do, and maybe if they were to pool, even if they were to pool their resources, it wouldn't be enough to deal with the Misty Mountains, and the Gondorians and the Dol Amrothians are trying to do so to beat Dale. Little do they know. Yeah, those Gondorian infantry units, I mean the ballista crew and what remained of the Rangers, well, still remains of the Rangers technically, but I mean Dol Amroth for Arathirim, will they outlast Gondor in this fight? I don't know, probably not now that they've charged in here and there are Barding Herd and black shots around. There goes Imrahil. So Dol Amroth, perhaps with those early betrayals, all of that artillery lost. And here we go. I notice on the mini-map there. This is the moment. This would be the moment where I think in voice chat it would be... I mean, it's all over at this point. There's nothing that can be done. The Athelian Rangers, if they tried to peel themselves off the Blackshot Dragonslayers, would rout instantaneously anyway, and that's the only thing Gondor have left to contribute, and it's not going to be enough. And with a battered unit of Barding Herd and a bloodied unit of Blackshot Dragonslayers, this is all that remains. Just on the horizon, poking out from behind the larger buildings that the outpost has to offer, and all that remains of Dale is going to rout pretty quickly under the sheer weight of armour-piercing infantry that remains. They do peel themselves off one another, but it's kind of a pointless gesture at this point. There's no way that victory can be achieved when the odds are this overwhelming. They can at least put aside their differences for the last time and finally see that the Misty Mountains have been so deceitful throughout this entire battle that, yeah, I mean, the Misty Mountains played a real blinder in this one, but everyone else allowed them to. Fool me once, fool me twice, etc, etc. And I don't think there's a single faction on the field today that wasn't on the receiving end of some trickery at the hands of the goblins. So Gondor do fall, Dale will come second, but that will be cold comfort to them as the Misty Mountains once again take a victory. And this one, I think, will be all the sweeter for Medexa and the Womb Raider, just based on how it came about. And perhaps there hasn't been a battle I've shown which showcases how lying in a free-for-all can get you exactly where you need to go. And there we have it. Very, very well played from the Misty Mountains. The 3 betrayals on this occasion. First to deal with all of that artillery from Dol Amroth, then to trick Gondor into a fight against Dale, which they never intended to commit to and instead backstabbed Gondor, and then finally really the betrayal against Dale was the reveal of all of those units at the end, because if they didn't keep those all in reserve, Dale must have thought that they were going to pull a victory out of the bag going into the late game there, but they were not. And in the end, the Misty Mountains victorious once again, even with the lower amount of kills that they have to show for it. So let's see what did the damage for the Misty Mountains during their many, many deceitful moments. Goblin King's Bodyguard, Bolg's Champions, Warg Riders, so the cavalry units early on doing well both as a blocking force against the Dol Amroth cavalry, but also that initial betrayal was definitely helped and facilitated by the mounted units that the Misty Mountains had. Heavy Goblin Halberds doing very nicely. Some units not so much, but you can't really account for that. And Mountain Orc Berserkers, of course, were really just the late game force which ensured a victory. As for Medexa, Heavy Goblin Crossbows doing quite nicely, as they often do. The Heavy Goblin Crossbows are such an important part of the Misty Mountains and how they get their business done. And the Bolg's Champions, once again, the rest of the units not so much. But in a free-for-all like this, you don't expect huge kill counts. It's all about when you use your units and the quality of said kills rather than the quantity that we often see in more traditional siege battles. But yes, probably one of the most interesting free-for-alls that I've shown on my channel since its inception, really, because this really does go to show that you can't trust anyone in a free-for-all, and the situation can change very, very quickly, and it's important that you've got to make the situation work for you. And I don't think the other three teams you've got to be observant, I suppose, is the main thing. The initial two betrayals were literal lying from the Misty Mountains, which they then took advantage of. But again, Gondor must have seen what happened to Dol Amroth early on. As soon as that happened, you cannot trust a word that that team says. You know, trust is built throughout the battlefield, and yeah, it wasn't to be. For Dale, to be fair, in the long run, like revealing hidden units right at the end to sweep through and finish the battle off is a very common way to see these free-for-alls end. So it wasn't so much a betrayal that finished Dale off, but yeah, it's definitely something disappointing if you're playing as Dale in this situation and you see that force reveal itself in the late game, considering how the Misty Mountains had managed to conduct themselves up to that point. But I really rate it. Like I said, from that point of view, probably one of the better free-for-alls that we have seen. So yeah, this actually marks the end of my backlog. I have managed to record basically a month and a half in advance now. I've also got the the video after this one's going to be the Melee Cavalry Knockout Tourney, which I've already recorded, I just haven't put it together yet. But that does take us up to a month and a half hence, and yeah, so that means basically I'm all caught up. Anytime I get given a replay at this point, I will be able to go through the whole process, and hopefully, like playing whack-a-mole, as each one pops up, I will be able to do it as and when. I think, I don't know, there's still things that are technically shifting around. It's kind of annoying, really. Like, I'm in kind of a tumultuous situation as it stands. We'll see how it goes. I mean, to be fair, I keep mentioning this at the tail end of my videos, but ultimately, at worst, things remain as they are from the channel, and people don't really notice anything from their perspective different. So, yeah, but it is the sort of thing to watch out for. Any news that I have that may affect the channel, I will, of course, post in the YouTube community section, or I'll do a channel update if it's substantial enough. But yeah, enough on that. For now, big thank you to the Womb Raider for sending this very interesting battle. Sorry that it took me so long to get to it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.